Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
Don't say anything about your little company, okay? Just let Emily have her moment. That was the message my mother sent me the morning of the dinner. No greeting, no warm let-in, not even a perfunctory, "How are you?" Just a quick, sharp reminder to stay in my lane. The words landed like a slap, though they weren't new. I'd heard them in 100 different versions over the years, some softer, some more brutal, but always carrying the same message underneath. Emily shines, and you don't get to make it about you. I stood in the narrow kitchen of my apartment, still in my old hoodie from college, holding my phone with that message open, letting it burn into my brain a little deeper. I was surrounded by work. Emails still unanswered, wireframes printed and pinned to the wall, coffee mugs with the logo of a company I helped build from scratch. 4 years of blood and caffeine and sheer stubborn belief. 4 years of making rent by the skin of my teeth, skipping meals to stretch payroll, pitching to investors who couldn't remember my name. But I kept going, not because anyone believed in me, but because I did. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, I was back to being the lesser daughter, the one who never quite measured up, the one who didn't do it the right way. Emily, my younger sister by 3 years, had just been promoted to regional vice president at some towering behemoth of a corporation. One of those companies with marble lobbies and self-cleaning espresso machines, and names that sounded like they were made in a lab. I can't even remember what they actually do. Something with logistics maybe, but it didn't matter. The title alone was enough to send our mother into orbit. She immediately scheduled a family dinner, the kind where she brought out the china and forced everyone to sit in the dining room instead of the kitchen. A big deal, an official celebration. I wasn't opposed to celebrating my sister. We'd had our rough years, okay, decades, but I never wanted to see her fail. That wasn't the point. The point was that every time I made even the tiniest move forward, my success was always seen as a threat to hers, as if recognition was a pie, and if I took even a crumb, she'd have less. I got dressed that evening in dark jeans and a soft blouse I hoped wouldn't be labeled trying too hard, grabbed a bottle of wine I could barely afford, and drove the 45 minutes to our family home in the suburbs. Same street lamps I'd stared at as a teenager from my bedroom window, same crack in the driveway, same porch light that flickered when you opened the front door. Inside, it smelled like lemon cleaner and nostalgia. My mom had gone overboard, as usual. White tablecloths, folded napkins, fresh flowers, candles flickering like this was a wedding rehearsal dinner. Emily was already holding court in the living room, one hand cradling a wine glass, the other gesturing as she told some polished story about an awkward client call that ended with her saving the deal. Everyone laughed a little too loud. My uncle was perched on the armrest of a chair like a teenager, already on his second beer, while my aunt had that tight smile she always wore when she felt outclassed. My dad, quiet as ever, was in the corner, half listening and checking something on his phone. And then there was my mom. She hugged me like I was a guest in her Airbnb, not her daughter. Her hands didn't rest on my back. They patted. 3 quick taps. She pulled away and gave me that look, half concerned, half disappointed. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping?" she asked. I nodded because anything else would start a conversation I didn't have the energy for. "No makeup today?" she added, in a tone that made it sound like an observation, but felt like a judgment. "You know, a little mascara wouldn't hurt. Just a thought." "I've been busy," I said, trying to sound neutral, trying to sound like I wasn't about to leave. "Well, you don't want to look like you've given up," she replied, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through bone. Emily came over then, radiant in some crisp designer blouse, hair perfect, earrings just the right size to whisper, "Executive," without screaming it. "Meg," she said, arms open. "You made it." I did. She kissed my cheek, barely touching me. "How's freelancing?" That word, freelancing, like I was designing logos in coffee shops for $20 a pop. Like I hadn't just signed a funding round most people in our town wouldn't believe. Like I hadn't hired a team, like I hadn't built something real. "It's good," I said, keeping my smile fixed. "Busy." Well, don't burn out, she said with a knowing little smirk, as if burnout was something you got from working too hard at a real job. Not something that came from juggling 1,000 roles just to stay afloat. We moved to the table. My mom brought out the wine like she was a sommelier. Toasts were made. Emily's promotion was announced again, louder, more formally. My aunt clapped. My uncle whistled. My dad raised his glass and said he was proud of her, which was rare enough that it made her eyes mist a little. And I just sat there. No one asked what I'd been up to. No one asked how work was. No one asked anything. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to applaud. So I did. I clinked glasses. I smiled. I nodded at all the right times. I laughed at her jokes. And I said nothing, because apparently that was my role. And I knew that if I even hinted at what I'd accomplished, what we'd built, my mother would give me that look. The same one she gave me when I brought home a B- in 10th grade. Like I'd embarrassed her just by trying. But the thing is, I wasn't embarrassed. Not anymore. And though I didn't know it yet, I wouldn't have to say a single word to change everything. Someone else was going to do it for me. The smell of overcooked salmon and steamed green beans filled the dining room as my mother made her usual rounds, placing dishes like trophies in front of each of us, careful to serve Emily first. She called it manners, Piwal, but we all knew better. Everything revolved around Emily, her preferences, her plans, her perfectly timed life events. The rest of us, especially me, were just props in a play where she had the lead, and everyone else got to mumble their one line before stepping off stage. I took my place at the far end of the table, not quite at the corner, but far enough away that I might as well have been in the kitchen. The seating arrangement was always strategic. Emily dead center with our parents flanking her like royalty, while the rest of us sat around her like loyal subjects. Even my dad, who spent most of these dinners pretending to be absorbed in his food, angled his body toward Emily as if waiting for his turn to be included in her spotlight. She was telling some elaborate story about a client crisis that required her to call in favors, coordinate teams across 3 time zones, and still manage to squeeze in a spin class. Everyone nodded as if she were describing a medical miracle. My aunt laughed too loud, her wine glass nearly tipping over, while my uncle kept asking for more details about the budget and how she managed those young hotshots out in the bay. My mother looked on like a proud stage mom, glowing every time Emily mentioned a VP or a high-level meeting. No one noticed I hadn't said a word. No one looked in my direction. I wasn't even sure if anyone remembered I was there. And yet I was more awake than I had been in weeks. Every cell in my body vibrating with the effort of holding myself still, holding my tongue, and pretending to be invisible without fully disappearing. I watched Emily gesture with her fork, polished nails catching the candlelight as she spoke about vertical integration and strategic pivots, as if she'd invented the terms. It wasn't that I didn't respect what she'd done. I did. Climbing the corporate ladder takes grit, and she had plenty of it. But the way our family treated her success like it was somehow sacred made me feel like I was made of cardboard. Like everything I had fought for, bled for, suffered for, had no weight in their world, because it didn't come with a title on LinkedIn, or a parking space, or quarterly bonuses. As I stabbed at my overcooked vegetables, I caught snippets of my mother whispering to my aunt about how Emily's promotion had come just in time, and how she was finally going to buy a condo in the good part of town. My aunt beamed and asked if she'd considered freezing her eggs yet. Emily laughed and said she didn't need to worry. Everything's falling into place. I chewed slower, biting back the urge to speak. There was a pressure building in my chest that I couldn't ignore much longer. Like trying to suppress a scream during a church sermon, I kept thinking of the last 3 months, working 16-hour days, landing a partnership that could potentially double our user base, closing our funding round after nearly 6 months of rejections and revisions, meetings that went nowhere. Then finally, that one investor who saw it, who saw me, but none of it mattered here, because no one at this table had ever asked what I was building. And then, as if the universe decided to test my resolve, my cousin Rachel, who had always been kind in that distant, polite way people are when they don't quite understand you, turned to me during a lull in conversation and asked the question I'd been waiting for all night. "So, Megan, what are you working on these days?" There it was, the opening, the one moment someone had acknowledged I existed as more than just a place setting. I took a breath, lips parting just enough to begin, and then my mother cut in, smiling too brightly, her voice sliding in like a blade between my ribs. "Oh, you know, Megan," she said, still doing her little thing with computers, startups and all that. "But let's not bore everyone. Emily, tell them about your new office. You said it's got a view of the skyline." Just like that, the attention shifted. The window closed. My cousin gave me a sympathetic look, half apology, half embarrassment, as if I'd shown up to a gala in gym clothes. My fork hovered in midair, forgotten. I felt my stomach twist, not from the food, but from the sharp, familiar stab of being rewritten in real time. My own mother had erased me, smoothed me into the background like an unwanted detail in a photo she planned to crop. The conversation surged forward without me. Emily described her corner office like it was a cathedral, every word soaked in pride and certainty. My mother nodded so hard I thought her neck might snap. My uncle made a joke about office politics, and everyone laughed except me. I kept chewing, tasting nothing. My mouth moved out of habit, not hunger, and all I could think was how exhausting it was to sit at a table with people who knew nothing about the real me, yet had already decided who I was allowed to be. I pushed my plate away quietly, folded my napkin, and excused myself to the bathroom. Once the door clicked shut behind me, I leaned against the sink, heart pounding, hands shaking with a mixture of anger and something I didn't want to name, grief, maybe, not for what I'd lost, for what had never been given. It's strange, isn't it? You spend your whole life thinking if you just do well enough, prove yourself enough, earn enough, then maybe the people you love will finally see you. But sometimes it doesn't matter how big the mountain you've climbed is. If they've already decided you belong at the bottom, they won't even bother to look up. And yet, somewhere deep inside, something was shifting. I didn't know it yet, but this dinner was the last time I would ever let them shrink me. I wiped my hands, looked myself in the mirror, and walked back out to the table. The noise washed over me again. Cutlery, laughter, the occasional clink of glass. No one had noticed I'd left. No one even paused as I slipped back into my seat. But I noticed, and the silence inside me was no longer empty. It was loaded, waiting. There's a kind of humiliation that doesn't leave bruises or scars you can point to later. It's soft and invisible, and practiced over years, like a well-rehearsed dance where everyone knows their place. And if you step even an inch out of line, the entire room adjusts to push you right back. That was exactly what it felt like, sitting in my mother's dining room, surrounded by people who had already decided who I was and who I was allowed to become. Not based on facts or curiosity, or even affection, but on a quiet hierarchy that none of them would admit existed out loud, even though they lived by it like it was gospel. Emily was the prodigy, the real thing, the one whose success could be proudly displayed like a trophy in a glass cabinet. And I was the footnote, the alternative ending no one asked for. After I returned to the table, still half shaken from the moment in the bathroom, I tried to convince myself that I could survive just a little longer. Just one more hour of smiling, nodding, and pretending that the woman who had co-founded a company, now valued in the millions, was just another lost cause who didn't quite make the family cut. But something inside me was fraying. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, resignation maybe. The bitter realization that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. Not for them, and especially not for her. Emily was leaning forward now, laughing as she described her new assistant. Finally, someone competent, and how she'd had to navigate an internal power struggle between two senior managers, both of whom, she added with a wink, secretly wanted my job. The table erupted with admiration. My aunt clutched her chest and said Emily had real steel, and my uncle, already buzzed from his third drink, muttered something about how Emily should run for Congress. My father chuckled politely, though I could see he wasn't following half the conversation. He never did. As long as nobody caused a scene and dessert came out on time, he considered the evening a success. Then came the toast. My mother stood, glass in hand, with that theatrical pause she always employed when she wanted the room to hush. The candles flickered behind her, and for a moment she looked almost regal. Her posture stiff, her chin lifted just enough to suggest she'd rehearsed this in the mirror. Maybe she had. "I just want to say," she began, and the room stilled. "How proud I am of you, Emily. You've worked so hard, stayed focused, and never lost sight of your goals. It's not easy to rise through the ranks, especially in this economy, but you've done it with grace and brilliance. You are an example of what persistence and excellence look like. I know your father and I say it often, but it's worth repeating. You've made this family proud." Emily gave a modest smile, the kind people practice for moments like this, and clinked glasses with my mother as the others joined in, one after the other, the air thick with applause and compliments. It was sincere. That's what made it so difficult. No one was faking it. They genuinely admired her. And somewhere beneath the burn in my chest, I understood why. But then, as the conversation lulled just slightly and people began reaching for more wine, or passing around the breadbasket, my cousin Rachel, perhaps emboldened by the earlier awkwardness, turned to me again. She didn't sound smug or confrontational, just curious, even warm. "Megan, you've been quiet tonight," she said. "What's been going on with your company? You mentioned it last time, right? Something tech-related?" I barely opened my mouth before I felt it. That sharp inhale across the table. My mother's hand moved subtly, not enough to draw attention, but just enough for me to notice the grip tightening on her wine glass. Her lips pursed, her shoulders tensed. I knew that look. It was the preemptive correction, the way she signaled that I was about to say something inconvenient, something that didn't serve the narrative she was trying to sculpt around Emily's big night. Still, I tried. "Well, actually, we just closed our Series A funding. It's been a long process, but..." My mother cut me off so smoothly that it might have sounded like she was just trying to keep things light. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone overly bright. "Let's not bore everyone with business talk tonight. This evening is about Emily. Let her have her moment." There it was, the sentence that hung in the air like smoke. Let her have her moment. A polite muzzle wrapped in a smile. The room shifted again just a little, enough that my cousin nodded and turned back to her salad, and my aunt asked Emily another question about the bonus structure at her company. Within seconds, I'd been erased again. Not with cruelty, but with something worse, indifference. And in that moment, I stopped hearing the conversation around me. I stared down at my plate, watching a lone green bean roll across the edge, and I felt a sensation I couldn't name at first. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't rage. It was something colder, a kind of clarity that sliced clean through all the noise and left me utterly alone in my skin. They would never see me, not unless someone forced them to. But I also knew I wasn't going to force anything, not tonight, not with words. Because what was the point of explaining your worth to people who had already decided it didn't matter? Why drag out a list of accomplishments like a trick pony, waiting for applause that would never come? So I stayed silent. I chewed my food and smiled at the right moments and let the rest of the night drift forward, wave after wave of polite conversation and familial performance. What none of them realized, what I didn't even fully grasp at that point, was that the silence they'd insisted on, the silence they thought they were using to control me, was already shifting in the walls around us, because when truth arrives, it doesn't always knock politely. Sometimes it kicks the door open, uninvited, and makes sure everyone hears it whether they want to or not. And someone else was about to do exactly that. I don't know if you've ever experienced one of those moments that shatter the rhythm of a room. A moment so unexpected that it doesn't just turn heads. It stops breath, not like a car crash or a slap or a shout. No, those are loud, obvious disruptions. This was something quieter and more elegant, but 10 times more devastating. And it started with the sound of a door opening that wasn't supposed to open again. The front door. It had been more than an hour since we all sat down. More than an hour of carefully curated toasts, stories, and polite laughter circling around Emily like she was the sun, and we were all lucky to bask in her glow. My mother had already started clearing the dessert plates, even though no one had asked for coffee yet. Emily was telling a story about her company's New York office, the one she might be moving to, while my aunt buzzed with envy, peppering her with questions about Manhattan rent and if she'd finally meet someone with a trust fund. I was halfway through a glass of wine I didn't like and didn't need, hoping it would blur the edges of the night just enough to keep me from screaming. And then the front door opened. Not a knock, not a bell, just the unmistakable sound of the handle turning, the heavy groan of the old hinges that my dad had never quite gotten around to oiling, and the soft thud of shoes stepping onto the entryway tile. The room didn't react right away. Conversations kept rolling forward for a second or two, everyone assuming it was some neighbor or maybe the delivery guy, even though we hadn't ordered anything. Then came a voice that didn't belong to anyone in the family. "Sorry I'm late, traffic was hell. Did I miss the toast?" The wine glass slipped a little in my hand, tilting just enough to splash against my knuckles. I turned my head slowly, afraid I was imagining it, that I'd conjured him out of some delusion driven by stress and humiliation. But no, there he was, Daniel. He stood in the doorway in dark jeans and a blazer that somehow made him look both casual and important at the same time. His hair was a mess, like he'd run a hand through it too many times, and his tie was tucked into his shirt, like he'd forgotten to take it off completely. And he was smiling broadly, like this was just another business mixer or late-night brainstorming session, not the highly orchestrated family dinner I hadn't even told him about. For a second, no one said a word. Not a sound. My mother froze with a dish in her hand, the edge of a fork poking over the rim. Emily's lips parted just slightly, the beginnings of a greeting or a question or maybe just confusion. My uncle raised his eyebrows like he was trying to place Daniel's face, like he was rifling through a mental Rolodex of acquaintances and realizing he'd never seen this man before. And then he walked toward the table, not hesitating, not faltering, not waiting for permission, and stopped right behind me. "You didn't tell me this was a formal thing," he said, still grinning as he looked down at me. "I almost showed up in sneakers." He clapped a hand lightly on my shoulder and turned to the table with a kind of relaxed confidence I could never have summoned in that house, not in a million years. "I'm Daniel," he said, addressing the room now. "Megan's business partner, or more accurately, co-founder. She's the reason we just closed a 7-figure deal last week, in case anyone here's been keeping score." Silence, not stunned admiration, not immediate applause, just silence. It wasn't hostile, not yet. It was something slower, more complicated, like the air had thickened, like everyone had to wade through their own assumptions before they could react. My mother finally blinked, her eyes narrowing in a way that made it painfully clear she was recalculating the entire night. Emily's face didn't move, not her mouth, not her eyes, not a twitch in her cheek. Nothing. She just stared at him, then at me, and back at him again, as though she were trying to understand if this was a prank or some incredibly inappropriate business stunt. My father finally cleared his throat and asked cautiously, "So you two work together?" Daniel chuckled. "More than work. We built the whole thing together 4 years ago, right from her kitchen table, actually." That was when it started to sink in. Daniel wasn't some random guy I'd dragged into the dinner to prove a point. He was the real deal, a CEO. The name on the articles they never read. The person who'd been in every investor meeting, every product pivot, every sleepless night spent wrestling with server crashes or customer churn rates. And now he was standing in the center of my mother's pristine dining room, giving my story a voice that couldn't be ignored. My aunt, clearly still catching up, tilted her head and asked, "Wait, are you talking about that app that just got picked up in TechCrunch last week? The one with the hiring algorithm?" Daniel nodded. "That's the one." The look she gave me was almost comical, a mix of disbelief and embarrassment, like she'd just realized she'd been sitting next to someone important without knowing it, like I'd been hiding a secret life under my cardigan. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm but a little too smooth, like she was trying hard not to let the edge in. I didn't realize Megan was involved in something that big. Daniel laughed, and it wasn't mean, but it wasn't gentle either. She didn't just get involved. She wrote the initial code base, handled our first 3 clients single-handedly, and pitched to half the investors while I was still figuring out our burn rate. She's the spine of the whole operation. And there it was, the truth, laid bare in the middle of the table, between the remnants of crème brûlée and coffee cups no one had touched. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd felt before. It wasn't the usual indifference. It wasn't dismissal or polite deflection. It was the sound of walls cracking, of illusions beginning to fall apart, of people realizing they had missed something crucial and were suddenly miles behind. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because the thing I'd been begging for all my life, not attention, not praise, but acknowledgement, had just arrived, uninvited, unapologetic, unmistakable, and it didn't come from me. It came from someone who had seen me at my worst, had built something with me from nothing, and still chose to walk through that door and say, "Look at her, look at what she's done. I didn't know what would happen next." But I knew this much. No one at that table could unhear what had just been said. For several long seconds after Daniel's words settled into the air, the room remained completely still, like someone had hit pause on the entire dinner. You could almost hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog through the walls. My mother stood at the edge of the dining room like a statue, still holding a plate in one hand, as if she'd forgotten what she was doing mid-movement. Her mouth was parted, but no sound came. My father, ever the man who avoided conflict like a drafty window, looked down at his empty wine glass and ran a thumb over the rim, his eyes flicking back and forth like he was waiting for someone else to speak first and save him from having to pick a side. Emily, still seated, slowly placed her napkin on the table, her fingers moving in an almost calculated way, like every gesture had to be measured now that the script had changed. She turned to Daniel and offered a thin smile, one of those facial expressions you give a colleague who just upstaged you in front of your boss. But her eyes, those gave her away. The mask held, but there was tension in her jaw, a flicker in her expression that couldn't quite be buried, no matter how practiced she was at staying poised. "Well," she said finally, and the silence cracked just a little, "I guess congratulations are in order. I had no idea Megan was doing all of that. You've been busy." There was something deliberately vague in her tone, a subtle distancing from the reality that had just been dropped at her feet. She wasn't going to challenge it directly, not yet, but she also wasn't ready to embrace it. That was Emily's move, always. Smile first, retreat to higher ground later, recalibrate once the room cleared. Daniel, completely unbothered by the undercurrent, took a seat at the end of the table and leaned back in the chair like he belonged there. He wasn't arrogant. He didn't have to be. He simply existed in a way that made others take notice. He had this ability to be both casual and authoritative, the kind of presence you either envied or trusted, depending on your own insecurities. My family didn't know what to make of him, but they couldn't ignore him, and that alone was enough to rattle the entire evening. "So how do you two know each other?" my aunt asked, her voice a little higher than usual, trying to inject some normalcy into the moment like she was patching a leak with Scotch tape. "We went to college together," Daniel said, his eyes on me now, not anyone else. "We met in a comp sci class. I thought I was hot shit until Megan rewrote my code in 15 minutes and found 3 bugs I hadn't seen in 2 weeks. I offered her half my protein bar and begged her to be my partner on the final project. She said no." The table chuckled, nervously at first, then with more ease. The laughter felt like a safety net being thrown out. My cousin smirked and asked if I was always that harsh, and I said I just had standards. For the first time all night, I heard my own voice echo around the room without being brushed aside or corrected or redirected toward Emily. I sounded calm, grounded, like someone who had been living a full life outside these walls, and they heard it. I could tell, every single one of them. But then came the shift, the one I should have seen coming. My mother stepped forward finally, setting the plate down a little harder than necessary, and gave Daniel a smile so tight it looked like it hurt her cheeks. It's very impressive what you both have accomplished. Of course, the tech world is always so unpredictable, lots of ups and downs. Megan's always had a tendency to dive headfirst into things, so I suppose it's lucky she's found someone to balance her out. There it was, the pivot. She couldn't erase the facts now, but she could recast them. If Daniel was the real success story, then maybe I had just tagged along. Maybe I'd gotten lucky. Maybe I was still the one who needed someone to balance her out, not the one holding the whole damn thing together. Daniel raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching like he might actually laugh. But he didn't. Instead, he just looked at her for a long second, that kind of silent stare people in power give, when they know they don't need to defend themselves. Then he looked at me, his face softening just enough, and said, "I've never had to balance Megan out. If anything, I've spent the last 4 years trying to keep up." My mother blinked like someone had just thrown cold water in her face. She wasn't expecting that. None of them were. Because the version of me they'd kept alive in their heads, the version that wandered from job to job, that played with business, that was always one misstep away from asking for help again, could not coexist with the woman Daniel was describing. I watched as the narrative cracked and buckled in real time. My cousin's eyes darted between us like she was seeing me for the first time. My aunt, usually the loudest voice at the table, sat back in her chair, her hand loosely gripping the stem of her wine glass. Emily folded her arms slowly across her chest, and though her expression didn't change, her foot started tapping under the table. It hit me then. None of them were angry. They were uncomfortable, because now they had to ask themselves why they hadn't known any of this before. Why I hadn't told them. Why I hadn't demanded they listen. And the truth, though I didn't say it out loud, was this. I had stopped telling them because they had never been interested in hearing it. And somewhere along the way, I realized that the hunger for validation I carried in my 20s had been slowly replaced by something harder and more useful, independence. Still, I wasn't made of stone. The way my mother looked at me, like she didn't know what to do with me now that I didn't fit into the shape she had assigned me, stung more than I wanted to admit. Daniel filled the silence again, casually asking if anyone had tried our app yet, if they'd seen the feature we launched last week, the one people were calling a game changer on Twitter. My aunt confessed she didn't even use Twitter. My uncle asked if the company had a name he would have heard of. When Daniel said it, I watched 3 different people at the table blink in recognition. They had heard of it. They just hadn't known I was behind it. I said nothing, because in that moment, I realized silence could be power too. Not the kind that erases, but the kind that reveals. The kind that lets people sit with their own assumptions and decide whether they're ready to let them go. And as the room slowly thawed, as dessert plates were finally cleared and fresh coffee was poured, I sat back in my chair, shoulders relaxed, hands folded calmly in my lap. The version of me they had invited to dinner was gone, and I wasn't going to be the one to bring her back. The coffee smelled burnt. It always did. My mother bought the same store-brand grounds in bulk, convinced that it was just as good as Starbucks if you added enough creamer and pretended not to notice the bitter aftertaste. She moved about the kitchen now with robotic precision, lips thin, eyes narrowed slightly at the edges, as if the act of pouring coffee was the only thing tethering her to the moment. My aunt offered to help, but my mother waved her off with a forced smile and an insistence that everything was under control. Everything was never under control with her, unless she was controlling it. Back at the table, the tension that had begun unraveling earlier had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. It no longer sat thick and silent like a fog pressing on everyone's chest. Instead, it had become a kind of cautious energy, a room full of people pretending they weren't still stunned while trying to recalibrate how to behave around the new version of me, the one they hadn't seen coming, hadn't imagined, hadn't accounted for in their long-standing assumptions. Daniel, unfazed by the shift, continued talking with my uncle about the hiring market, the algorithm we had built, and how our recent client had saved over 200 hours in recruiting within a single month. It was surreal to watch the same man who had once called me directionless, now leaning forward, engaged, nodding like he was taking mental notes. My cousin Rachel asked if the company might go public someday, and I responded carefully, mentioning that we were still early in the game, but that the trajectory was promising. She smiled, a little stunned, and I could see it in her eyes. She was replaying every conversation we'd had in past years, searching for signs she had missed. Emily remained quiet, sipping her coffee without a word, her back straight, her gaze mostly fixed on a random spot on the tablecloth. She hadn't spoken to me directly since Daniel arrived. I didn't need her to. Her silence was its own kind of speech, eloquent in the way it concealed nothing. There was resentment in her stillness, not because I had succeeded, but because I had succeeded outside her version of reality. She was always the one who followed the map, who stayed on the path, who played by the rules. I had wandered into the woods, built a fire from nothing, and now stood there, warm and alive, while she tried to understand how I'd survived. I had no intention of delivering a speech. I wasn't going to grandstand or offer up my accomplishments like a menu of guilt. But there was a part of me, a small, quiet part, that had been curled up and cautious for too long, that finally stretched out and took up space. So when my aunt asked what it was like to run a startup, if it was all high energy and free snacks and roller coaster meetings like the movies made it seem, I looked around the table and decided to answer with the truth. It's hard, I said, my voice steady. It's sleepless nights. It's fighting to keep the lights on when your bank account dips below 3 digits. It's getting rejected by people who don't even bother to spell your name right in their email. It's doubting yourself every other day, and then waking up and doing it anyway because you believe in something no one else can see yet. The room went quiet again, not frozen like before, but thoughtful. My father looked up, his brow furrowed in that way it always did when he was trying to understand something he hadn't been prepared to hear. My mother stood near the entry to the dining room, her hand resting on the door frame, coffee pot still in hand, unmoving. It's losing friends because you don't have time to call them back. It's missing birthdays and weddings because you're on a deadline. It's watching your peers buy houses and take vacations while you're still eating ramen and fighting off anxiety attacks in your car. And it's choosing to do it all anyway. Not for the money or the title, but because something inside you refuses to quit. No one interrupted. No one tried to pivot the conversation. Even Emily looked at me now, not with the old pity or scorn, but with something colder and more fragile. The look of someone realizing that all the sacrifices she'd made to be seen as exceptional hadn't been enough to keep her alone at the top. I kept going, not out of anger, but because I needed it said, needed it to exist outside of me, in the air, where it couldn't be denied anymore. And when it starts to work, when you finally get that call, or that check clears, or that client says yes, it's not relief, it's not even pride. It's grief, in a weird way, because you realize how much you gave up to get there, how many moments you missed, how long you went without being believed in. My mother looked down then, not a dramatic gesture, not ashamed, but thoughtful, like she too was tracing a map in her mind and finding empty spaces she hadn't noticed before. Daniel said nothing during the whole thing. He didn't need to. He'd heard me say parts of this before, in late-night rants and tired sighs across Slack messages and half-lucid conversations after marathon pitch meetings. But this wasn't for him. It wasn't even for them, really. It was for me. For the version of me that had sat at that same table 100 times, waiting for someone to ask the right question, waiting for someone to say they were proud, waiting for someone to see past the old expectations and recognize the woman who had crawled through her own self-doubt and come out the other side. When I finally stopped talking, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. I didn't mean to steal the night, I said quietly, breaking the tension. I came here to celebrate Emily. I really did. Emily gave a small, brittle smile, and for a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that wasn't quite anger, not quite envy, not quite regret. It might have been recognition, but I wasn't going to beg for it. I know I've been quiet, I added, but that wasn't because I had nothing to say. No one argued, no one challenged. My aunt nodded slowly, and my uncle muttered something about not realizing. My cousin looked at me like she wanted to apologize but didn't know how to start. And my mother finally turned and walked back into the kitchen, her footsteps softer than usual, like she was carrying more than the coffee pot. That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't rewrite years of neglect, or turn strained relationships into hugs and hallmark warmth, but it did something else. It exposed the wound, and sometimes that's the first step toward healing, just letting the air hit it. Just saying the truth out loud, even if it makes the whole room uncomfortable. By the time the evening began to dissolve into the awkward shuffle of half-hearted goodbyes and the ritualistic scraping of chairs across polished hardwood floors, something in me had already begun to shift in a way that was subtle but irreversible. It was not a dramatic unraveling or a loud emotional collapse. It was quieter than that, like a door that finally creaks open after years of being stuck, revealing a way out you had always hoped existed but had stopped expecting to find. The conversation around me had returned to its familiar rhythms, questions about school districts and summer travel plans, and that one neighbor who apparently still hadn't trimmed their hedges. The spotlight had dimmed, not because the truth had lost its power, but because people had retreated into the safety of ordinary talk, unable or unwilling to sit too long with the discomfort that had briefly disrupted their carefully maintained family mythology. I excused myself without ceremony, quietly gathering my coat from the back of the kitchen chair, where I had draped it hours earlier, slipping it over my shoulders like armor. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going or why I was leaving before dessert. I suppose part of them expected it, as if I were fulfilling some old prophecy that had been written years ago, the difficult daughter who always found a way to exit early, the one who never quite fit the table even when there was an empty seat. Daniel walked me to the door without saying much. He didn't offer words of encouragement or try to dissect the evening into tidy pieces of comfort. He simply stood beside me, letting the silence between us hold everything it needed to hold. We had been through worse together, brutal pitch meetings, missed flights, technical breakdowns at the worst possible moments. But this was different. This wasn't about the company or the pressure of leading something people believed in. This was about what happens when the people who raised you cannot make room for the person you've become. When I stepped outside, the night air was cold and sharp against my skin, slicing through the lingering heat of the dining room like a blade. I walked slowly to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, each step louder than it should have been in the quiet of the neighborhood. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some doors, once you walk through them, no longer hold any temptation to reopen. The drive home was long, a winding series of suburban roads and highway exits I knew too well, each one a reminder of the years I had spent trying to prove something to people who had already made up their minds. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just drove, windows rolled halfway down, the radio off, letting the silence stretch as wide as it needed to. There was a strange peace in it. Not joy, not relief, just peace. The kind that comes when you finally accept that closure doesn't always come with an apology. When I reached my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter and stood for a moment in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the sketches still pinned to my walls. Reminders of what I was building, of what I had chosen every single day for the last 4 years. The quiet was thicker here, but it didn't feel empty, it felt earned. This space, this life, this version of me, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was honest, and no one had handed it to me. I was halfway through changing into pajamas when my phone buzzed from somewhere under a stack of notebooks on the kitchen table. I found it by the glow of the screen. One message, one name, Emily. The preview was short. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen without touching it. heart not racing but slowing, sinking. I didn't open it, not right away. I just looked at her name, the way it was written in my contacts without emojis or affectionate nicknames. Just her name, Emily, my sister, my rival, my mirror in a house where only one of us had been allowed to take up real space. When I finally opened the message, it was longer than I expected, but still frustratingly vague. I didn't know, I honestly didn't. I thought you gave up. I thought you just drifted. I didn't realize you were still trying, or that you'd actually built something. I guess I just didn't think to ask. I'm sorry, I don't know what else to say. I'm trying to understand. I read it twice, then a third time, and still I couldn't tell what I felt. Part of me wanted to reply immediately, to reach across the chasm that had defined our relationship for so long, to say something comforting or forgiving or even bitter. Another part of me wanted to let the silence stretch a little longer, not out of cruelty, but because I wasn't sure if I was ready to be the one who always made it easy for her to catch up. For most of our lives, she had been the one chosen. By our mother, by the family, by the narrative that had been built around us like scaffolding. I had been the one dismissed, the one talked around, the one who was told to be patient, to be quieter, to let her have her moment. But in the end, I had chosen myself, every day, over and over again. And now, standing in my own apartment, staring at the message blinking back at me in that pale white font, I realized how powerful that choice had been. I didn't reply that night. I set the phone down, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed, the hum of the city filtering in through the windows. Tomorrow, there would be meetings, calls, problems to solve, and maybe even a decision about whether to return that text. But tonight, I wasn't chasing anyone's validation. I wasn't trying to explain myself to people who had refused to listen. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.